Okay, well, hello everyone, and welcome to this first sort of session for the Pink Singers Archives. It's Manifestos, Marches, and Morality, 50 Years of the Gay Liberation Front from 1970 to 2020. For the purposes of those of you who are new to the Pink Singers, or people who have never really been aware that the Pink Singers actually has an archive team, the reason we do that is, I think, quite clear from events of the last couple of weeks, where we know that history is written by the victors and the people who have power, and they they write the stories, they write the textbooks, and they create statues to themselves. So it is really incumbent upon us as marginalized people to record our own stories and to make sure that these stories are transmitted and carried on for the future. We're very lucky in the Pink Singers in that we're a quite diverse group of people. We have representation from different groups underneath the LGBT rainbow. It's really quite unusual in terms of LGBT groups. And the other thing that we do have is intergenerationality. So we are made up of people from different age groups within the LGBT community, which gives us an opportunity to capture a variety of different stories from different people across different times. And that really leads us to this meeting today, which is a conversation that we're going to be having with Philip, Martin, and Michael around the Gay Liberation Front, or GLF. 2020 marks the 50th anniversary of the formation of the GLF, which is probably one of the most significant and seminal organizations in the LGBT movement here in the UK. The GLF is responsible for, amongst many things, what we consider as Pride today, the Pride March. So there's a lot of other contributions to it and many lessons that we can learn from the rise of the GLF and then its eventual sort of implosion just 3 years later. It only existed for 3 years, but it was a very significant impact on LGBT activism in the UK today is still felt. So let me just quickly introduce to you each of our speakers today. So the first person I want to introduce is Philip. Philip Rescorla, who is, gosh, I don't know whether he even needs an introduction, to be honest. He is basically the ambassador for the Pink Singers. He's been entertaining audiences with the Pink Singers since 1986 when he joined the choir. And he has incredible stories about what LGBT life was like over the last really 4 or 5 decades. So we're really looking forward to hearing his stories because he was actually a member of the GLF at the time. With Philip is Martin. Martin is Philip's long-suffering partner. I wouldn't say long-suffering necessarily, but certainly as a spouse of a member of the Pink Singers, he's given up a lot of things in life, and he's also he's also contributed many things to the choir. So Martin was one of the original founders of FOPS, which is the Friends of the Pink Singers. And for many years, Martin accompanied us traveling around the world, and he was the bag chaperone for the choir, also known affectionately as the choir camel, because he basically had to keep track of all our bags when we went off on rehearsals. And finally, I want to introduce Michael Derrick, once again, someone with a long history with the Pink Singers. Since 1986, doesn't really need an introduction from me. He's been a musical director, an accompanist, and a singer, and continues to do many amazing things around music and activism for the Pink Singers. So we're very fortunate that we have people who were active in the GLF or actually the Campaign for Homosexual Equality, or CHE, back in the 70s, and this is an opportunity to hear some of the stories from them. To give a bit of context, we have Chris, who is joining us. Chris is actually our lead archivist for the Pink Singers, and he does it in his day job. So I'm really glad that he also does it in his free time. I don't know why, but thank you. Chris's interest in LGBT history has led him to curate several exhibitions, including one on the Metro charity and one on Southern LGBT groups. So he has got a vast interest and experience in telling LGBT stories. So Chris, do you want to sort of take it away?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. So I'm not going to go back into the full depths of time. I'm just going to give a brief kind of run up to the GLF. It kind of starts in the 1950s, really, when the police began arresting people at a far larger rate than they had previously been doing, although they had been arresting men, obviously, for homosexual offences going back centuries, and particularly from the 1890s onwards, they began to arrest men for usually cottaging or soliciting, or importuning, as was the phrase that was used. But in the 1950s, that started to ramp up significantly. And there were some really high-profile arrests. There were up to sort of 1,000 people were arrested or imprisoned each year, apparently. And undercover police officers would pose as gay men soliciting in public places. They were known as the pretty policemen. So they'd sort of go into the public toilets and stand there looking hopeful and then pounce on men. There were some really high-profile arrests in the 1950s, including the actor John Gielgud and the journalist Peter Wildeblood and Michael Pitt Rivers. And they had a really high-profile court case. Peter Wildeblood, I think they both went to prison, actually. And they were kind of involved with a guy called Baron Montague, who was a witness for the prosecution, and Baron Montague didn't get in prison. Also in the 1950s, Alan Turing, the scientist, committed suicide in 1954 after his forced chemical castration treatment that he took in lieu of being imprisoned. And all of these kind of high-profile cases led to the formation of the Wolfenden Committee in 1954, which looked into homosexual offences and prostitution. And it was led by Lord Wolfenden, whose own son was gay, so he had a personal interest in kind of pushing that agenda. And the commission for that was launched in 1957, which subsequently led to the partial decriminalisation of those offences in 1967, which allowed consenting gay men to have sex in private over the age of 21. So the 1950s, after sort of in the context of this commission being launched, the 1950s and early and 60s was an era where there was campaigning began to support the commission and kind of lead its aims. So the Homosexual Law Reform Society was set up in 1958 to campaign for the aims of the Wolfenden Commission. They were supported by the Albany Trust, which was a charity. The Northwest Homosexual Law Reform Society was then set up in 1964, and that became the campaign for homosexual equality around 1969. I think it was actually formalised in 1971. And that campaign led to a series of branches around the country that sort of developed in the following years. So there were CHE branches all over the country. There's about 100 groups in total, with 5,000 members that lasted until the late 70s, more or less. And in London, the first gay social group was called the SK Group, which started in 1968 in Limehouse, which was actually a Church of England institution, but that was the very first kind of social gay men's group. Obviously, this is in a sort of wider context of civil rights, and the Stonewall Riots took place in 1969 in New York City, although there had previously been riots for trans communities at Compton's cafeteria in San Francisco in 1966. And prior to that, I think it was the gay men's riot at Cooper Donuts in Los Angeles in 1959. So obviously Stonewall is the big one that people remember now, because that led to the foundation of the Gay Liberation Front in New York in 1969, directly in response to the riots in New York. But it's also important to recognise this kind of wider context of the civil rights movement, the women's liberation movement. In 1956 in the UK, the Sexual Offences Act recognised sexual assault between women for the first time. So although lesbian acts had never been illegal, like lesbians really didn't exist in the law until that point. And there was also the Abortion Act in 1967, which allowed women to have abortions. And the women's liberation movement was going on with things like the Ford Dagenham strikes in 1968, and the first Women's Lib conference was also, I think, 1968. Also just to kind of consider, I mean, there weren't that many campaigning trans organisations, but there were things like the Beaumont Society, which started in 1966 to support people in London who cross-dress, were transvestites or transsexual. And there was a ruling in 1970 that kind of rolled back the rights of trans people, and it only allowed intersex people to be recognised as a different sex. So that wasn't updated until 2004 with the Gender Recognition Act. And also the kind of British Black Power movement was happening at the same time. The United Coloured People's Association was founded, the British Black Panther movement, those were 1967, 68. Yeah. So the Gay Liberation Front was kind of happening in a wider context of things going on, and especially kind of gay activism in New York. So the founders of the London or the UK Gay Liberation Front were Aubrey Walter and Bob Mellor, and they had been to Gay Liberation Front meetings in New York, and they met personally at a conference of the Black Panther Party in Philadelphia called the Revolutionary People's Constitutional Convention. So they set up the GLF in London as primarily an activist organisation. So the Campaign for Homosexual Equality was kind of a campaign for rights, and it also set up kind of social activities and campaigning around the country. But the GLF was primarily activism based, and they kind of set up to make protests and take to the streets. They had their first meeting in the basement of the London School of Economics in October 1970, and they went on to have weekly meetings of around 200 to 300 people. They also published a manifesto and a set of demands, which hopefully we'll get one of the guys to read in a minute. The GLF had various groups. They had a street theatre group. They had a newsletter called Come Together. There were some women in the GLF who set up a women's group. There was a communes group, a youth group, and a transvestite and transsexual group. Hopefully we can talk about this in a minute, but the kind of the protests of the GLF are quite amazing. One of them, the big one, was really at the Christian Festival of Light in 1971, where the GLF invaded Westminster Central Hall, where Mary Whitehouse, who was a Conservative campaigner, and Cliff Richard, the singer, and Malcolm Muggeridge, who was a journalist, they were kind of holding this series of conferences and events for the Christian Festival of Light, and the GLF activists took over the venue in drag and released mice around the floor, and they turned up all the lights. And the GLF Women's Lib group took over the National Women's Liberation Conference in Skegness to claim territory for lesbians in the feminist movement. And they also attacked some of them. So the Red Lesbians attacked the Stock Exchange, and they also protested the policies of the Gateways Club. But the big one that's kind of significant for this year is that the GLF started the first Pride marches. So in 1970, there was a small march of about 150 men walking through Highbury Fields, and then they held a gay day in 1971 in Hyde Park and Trafalgar Square that was run by the youth group. And then in 1972, they held the first kind of proper gay Pride march from Trafalgar Square to Hyde Park. I mean, the GLF only lasted until I think 1973, but lots of things grew out of the GLF, such as the Brixton Fairies, the Gay Men's Press, the Blue Lips theatre group, and kind of Stonewall and Outrage, and these later kind of campaigning organisations were also founded on, lots of the principles developed during the GLF. And there was also a lot of campaigning that, during the HIV/AIDS epidemic, which drew on the knowledge and the networks developed during this time, this early period of connection. So I hope that kind of gives, a good brief context to start with. But maybe we can move on to some kind of discussion. I don't know if you've got any ideas of how, or maybe did you say that we're going to get someone to read the manifesto demands? Sian, I don't know who, was that Philip or Martin? I don't know.
So Philip, I have a copy of the original manifestos. Would you be able to read that?
Are we unmuted? We're unmuted. Can you hear us? Good. It's fascinating to hear that really very good summary of what was happening there. Can I just say, though, that it sounds though there was a lot going on, but before the Gay Liberation Front formed, if you were a gay woman or a gay man, there was silence. In fact, you didn't even know what the word gay was. Gay was not the normally used word. And so, first of all, no political party supported gay rights, not even the revolutionary left. The general atmosphere towards gay people was one of tolerance and sympathy. There were very few meeting places, and certainly none that were advertised. You couldn't contact people. There were no small ads to get in touch. So it really was, the Gay Liberation Front really brought homosexuality out of the closet with a bang, you know, and instead of respect and tolerance, a sort of tolerance and sympathy, we wanted respect and acceptance. And I was actually at the very first meeting, which was on Wednesday, October the 4th, 1970, of the Gay Liberation Front. And you might want to see what dragged me in, because I happened to be studying at the LSE in October. It was my first week, and I saw this poster, if you can see it, it would come out, and it says, "Come and join the sisters and brothers of the Gay Liberation Front." Now, I had no idea what gay liberation was, because gay was not a word that was used. And the picture doesn't actually give you a clue. If you can see, it's a great picture, but could be anybody really. So I went along completely nonplussed, and then I realized, oh, okay, there were 19 people there. They're all queer. I'm in the right place. And we decided, as one of the things during that meeting, was to go and leaflet Earl's Court, where a lot of the pubs were, Oxford Circus, to encourage people to come along to the next meeting and to actually get things going. And one of the things that we drafted were some demands of the Gay Liberation Front. And if you see, it also says here, gay is good, which was a pinch really from the Black Power movement, who came up with the phrase black is beautiful. And so as a result, we turned it to gay is good. And on the top, again, it tells you where the meeting is going to be. So you've got the demands and the meeting. Okay, I'll read the demands. The Gay Liberation Front demands that all discrimination against gay people, male and female, by the law, by employers, and by society at large, should end. That all people who feel attracted to a member of their own sex be taught that such feelings are perfectly normal. That sex education in schools stop being exclusively heterosexual. That psychiatrists stop treating homosexuality as though it were a problem or sickness, and thereby giving gay people senseless guilt complexes. That gay people be legally free to contact other gay people through newspaper ads, on the streets, and by any other means they may want, as are heterosexuals, and that police harassment should cease right now. That employers should no longer be allowed to discriminate against anyone on account of their sexual preferences. That the age of consent for gay males be reduced to 16. And finally, that gay people should be allowed and feel free to hold hands and kiss in public, as are heterosexuals. Tell me, how many of you still feel free to hold hands and kiss in public in 2020? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Philip. That was really interesting. I think just for the purposes of people in this conversation, would you be able to talk to us a little bit about what LGBT life or homosexual life, I guess, was like in the 60s? So I guess there must have been some kind of transition following partial decriminalization. Did you feel that there was greater freedoms? Did you feel that there was any social change? And then I suppose in the context of that, what drew you to the GLF and the kind of activities that they did?
Thanks. Did the '67 Act make a difference? Well, I suppose it did, but it didn't for gay people. I mean, there were first of all, there were only a few bars, and they didn't necessarily identify gay. So there was the Salisbury in St Martin's Lane, which was a theatre bar, still there but no longer gay. There was the Royal Vauxhall Tavern and the Black Cat were in existence, but they were mostly tourist pubs at the time, where you went along to see drag acts. There were gay people there, but And of course, there were several bars in Earl's Court. There was the Coleherne and the Boltons. And they were very closeted. In fact, when we went leafleting on that first Saturday after the first meeting, we got a very poor reception from the people in the Earl's Court bars. Their basic answer was, for God's sake, don't put your head above the parapet. We'll have the police after us. You know, you're rocking the boat, and we're fine, we're fine. And all the organisations that Chris mentioned were very much letter-writing organisations. They didn't have any influence with, you know, the politicians. And indeed, Leo Absey, who put forward the Sexual Offences Act, said, I hope now I've done this, that the homosexuals will go away and be grateful for the freedom and the rights we've given them. So there was nothing. So when gay liberation came along saying gay is good, we're fine, the problem is not with us, it's with society, and we're not going to kowtow to those standards. It was life-changing. You know, it gave you a confidence about yourself, and you were also meeting with mainly other young people who were into politics with a P and who'd been following other groups. So the Women's Liberation, some of their women joined this, and even in Women's Liberation, some of the lesbians did not feel comfortable, and the people from the far left did not feel comfortable. There was homophobia. So that was the situation. That was why Gay Liberation Front really had a huge impact. And also, we started doing street theatre. Street theatre, you see, if you dig it, do it. And you mentioned the first ever gay rights demo, which is on November the 27th, 1970. 150 people went to Highbury Fields to protest against the police arresting someone for cruising. And that got us into the papers. The first time a gay demonstration was reported in the British press, in the Times, in that. I get quite emotional about this because it really was a big impact. And by the time we got to December, there was something like 500 people coming along to the meetings. We actually got too big for the meetings in the LSE. Over to you.
I guess one of the most interesting things, I suppose, is how the CHE, which was the other big organization at the time, had a different approach to LGBT rights. I think perhaps Michael, do you want to talk to us about your experience in the LGBT scene in Durham, where you studied, and then coming down to London, and then what drew you to the CHE rather than the GLF?
I came down from Durham University in 1972, and before that, in Durham, there was nothing going on at all. The only time you learnt that somebody was homosexual was when they were sacked. So there obviously no pubs, clubs, anything at all like that. So when I came down to London, I started using all the social groups and things that I could. And I quickly joined a group for campaigning for homosexual equality. First of all, the one that met in the Chapstow in Notting Hill Gate, which had a lot of very interesting speakers like Lord Soper, Alan Ayckbourn, Kenneth Williams came along. And in a group of mainly gay men, half drunk, he would tell hilarious stories of antics on holiday in Morocco with Joe Orton. Oh, sorry, that's not really gay liberation, is it? Campaign for Homosexual Equality was based rather like a political party. There was a constitution, standing orders, local groups like Labour Party, Conservative Party, that sort of thing, meeting to find out what was going on nationally, to be aware, not very much actual activism, except, as Philip said, letter writing and so on, and also great social groups. I visited my MP with a couple of other people in the Westminster constituency to talk to him about homosexual law reform, and he was quite optimistic about it. Actually, it was his name was Christopher Tugendhat, the father of the Tugendhat, who's in the news currently very prominently, and I also sponsored the candidate for in the by-election where there was a homosexual law reform candidate came forth. We came after the Conservatives, the Labour, the Liberal, Oh, we came fifth. We came after the Ecology Party, which was what the Green Party was then. But we beat the National Front. When I started going to other groups, I used to do a lot of work with the late, great Martin Corbett, who was the person who turned off the electricity in that meeting that Chris was talking about. He worked in a hardware shop, and he was part of the demonstration. He turned up in his dungarees and a clipboard and a lot of electrical equipment. And he walked round to a side door in the hall and said that he was from the electricity board and he needed to monitor their main switchboard. And they led him down, and he started bringing out equipment and plugging it in and making notes. And he said to him, "It's all right, you can leave me now. I'll tell you when I'm finished." And they left him alone. And as soon as he was left alone, he pulled the main switch, which cut off the lights, and also cut off the microphones when in the middle of one of Mary Whitehouse's speeches. She was absolutely furious. Then he took out all the fuses so they couldn't switch it on again, and just walked out of the building saying, "Thank you very much, you've been very, very helpful." But Martin Corbett was terrific, a real star in the gay liberation movement. He was very early on, helping to set up Pink Gay News, and then later on an activist in ACT UP. I did work with him. For example, we were involved with a campaign to get Gay News stocked in what's the name of that? Philip, you remember what was W.H. Smith's? W.H. Smith's. The thing is, W.H. Smith's didn't stock Gay News, and it wouldn't order you Gay News. You could order any book or magazine there, but it would not order Gay News. This made it very difficult to access Gay News all over the country. The focus of Martin and I's campaign was the fact that in prisons, you can buy newspapers, magazines and books, but the sole distributors of all reading material in prisons was W.H. Smith's. So as a prisoner, you couldn't have Gay News, and that was the focus of our, and we leafleted discos and pubs and so on. Chris also mentioned police action. I was leafleting around Earl's Court, doing all the pubs and in the street and so on. And I had a lot of leaflets left at closing time, and I didn't know what to do with them. So I went round the corner into Wharfdale Street behind Coleherne. How many people are giggling here? Which was the cruising area where men went to have sex in the street and in front gardens around the back of the pub if they hadn't been successful in the pub that night. And I started leafleting the men. If they were having sex, I just tucked a leaflet into their back pocket and moved on. And I went down the whole street, and as I turned the corner, to my horror, there was a police car, and immediately 3 police officers jumped out and surrounded me and asked me what I was doing. And I said innocently, "Oh, I've been handing out leaflets." And one of the police officers said, "Is this anything about the recent police action in Clapham?" I said, "What police action in Clapham?" And then another of the police officers, who realized that they had said something really quite wrong, said, "Can I have a look at the leaflets?" I said, "Certainly," and I handed them out to them. And then they realized that I was a harmless gay activist. And they said, "Oh, we'll probably see you on the gay march," because we were probably on duty, and they were kind of over friendly in a sort of horrible way, and let me go. And then I gave the leaflets out all the way down the King's Road on the way home. But police action, they would raid pubs. I've been in places that have been raided by police officers, lots of intimidating. All pubs and clubs used to have to pay off the police, and if they didn't pay off the police and give them lots of money, the police would just raid them on the pretext that drugs were being sold and distributed, and then you'd close the place down. I'll stop there. I could go on and on.
Thank you very much. Well, that's absolutely fascinating. And it's interesting that I think police is a topic that keeps coming back up when it comes up when we're talking about rights, even to this day. I think there's obviously been a lot of change that has happened, and we actually have members in the police in our choir. But this is a discussion that still needs to continue to be interrogated. Martin, I think let's go to you, because clearly the situation between GLF and CHE is not an either-or one. What is your experience of the CHE and perhaps the GLF in that time period?
Well, I've got a slightly different experience because mine wasn't London. I was actually in Cardiff. I went to Cardiff, university in Cardiff called University of Wales Institute of Science and Technology. And I can say it in Welsh. Yes, that was my university. There was another university in Cardiff called Cardiff University. I actually got involved with the local Che group in Cardiff, but we also had a visit from a radical drag queen from GLF called Claudia, and she came down and talked to the Che people about how in London things were getting more radical or whatever. And so anyway, to cut a long story short, I founded the first gay sock in Wales, which was I was asked to do an article for the student magazine, and Philip, if you could pass me the folder. And yes, this is the badges folder, in case you're wondering. But that was the article, the first article in a university magazine in Wales, possibly the first gay article in Wales. But anyway, so I started the gay sock, and it was very much based on GLF principles. But I came to London in 1972. Well, I lived in London, obviously. When I came back in the end of term, we had the big march through London, so I joined that. And then it was soon after that I went to a gay disco, and I met someone who you probably know. And yes, we've been together ever since. So yeah, it's a pretty personal thing, but that's what GLF means to me, him.
I think there was a certain element of tension between Gay Liberation Front and CHE. Very much, I think now Stonewall is very much the current way that CHE went on, lobbying and writing. And Peter Tatchell's outrage is probably what we remember from GLF days. But in fact, because it used to be called the Committee for Homosexual Equality, and they only changed their name to Campaign once GLF came in. But eventually we all merged. So, for example, Che created London Friend, a counselling service, and the GLF created Icebreakers, which was the first ever counselling service. So they did get along, but I think probably Che was a bit too respectable for GLF, didn't he?
Yeah, I'm just reading a little bit on the history of the GLF, particularly in America where it started. The GLF was kind of set up in the wake of Stonewall as a more radical approach to LGBT rights. There were already sort of more assimilationist groups in Philadelphia who actually organized really the first ever Pride March up in Philadelphia. But they were, I guess one might consider them a bit more conservative, whereas the GLF came out of, I guess, more radical policies around trans activism and around socialist principles and black activism. So the principles that I think Martin alluded to around sort of inclusion of oppressed minorities and about sort of collaborating and working as allies, I think that came a lot from that tradition of protest, and it was very much a young person's protest rather than I know the GLF, looking at the GLF in America and how they describe the more traditional leaders of the LGBT community as being sort of stuffed white people in suits. I think to a certain extent that reflects a lot of the dialogue that we are having today as well around sort of gay rights and our allyship with other sort of marginalized communities. Chris, did you want to sort of ask any specific?
Yeah, I think what you're talking about is quite interesting. It'd be quite interesting to hear from you what your perception was of kind of allies in inverted commas, because I read that during the Festival of Light March in 1971, where the GLF was kind of doing its street protests and things, there were also hundreds of hippies, you know, straight hippies, sort of throwing stink bombs and things at the marchers and jeering at them. So I'm quite like, there's obviously a kind of, the GLF is doing a very specific agendaed protests, but there is a sort of wider culture of protesting against conservatism and kind of various allies who are interested in that. I'd be quite interested to hear if there was any kind of communication outside of GLF with that whole process, or you're on mute.
Yes, very much so. In fact, one of the first demonstrations the Gay Liberation Front people went on was a TUC demonstration against employment rights. And we also had quite close links with the women's movement. So, for example, the very famous 1970 Miss World contest, which, as a film came out recently, Misbehaviour. And some of the GLF street theatre went along and joined the women's groups in about that. And some of the men dressed up as drag queens. So we had misused, misconceived, mistreated, and they all took part. And so there were links there. And indeed, most political left-wing events. But what tended to happen early days was if we went to a left-wing march, we got stuck at the back of the march because they were a bit embarrassed by our presence. And, you know, we were sort of the poor relation. But no, very much the message was we are all in this together. It's not just about LGBT rights. It's about rights across the board.
Chris, you want to say anything more?
Sorry, I was on mute. Thanks. That's really interesting. Perhaps you could talk a little bit more about this street theatre, because I think so. I mean, I know Stuart Feather and a few other people from the GLF, and I've sort of the stories from that era about the theatre element of the protest. I think are brilliant, and you know, if anyone hasn't seen Stuart talking about the Festival of Light, I'd really recommend looking that up on YouTube, because he did some readings from his book Blowing the Lid that kind of talks about that, and all these great stories about the way that the street theatre was crucial in that. But I'd love to hear from you your memories of the various street theatre actions.
I suppose the best record you've got of it is the picture that you've used to illustrate this talk, which was at the first ever march in August 1971. And the street theatre joined with the youth group in a thing called Picking a Chicken. And it was actually about the age of consent, but it was more than about that. And I think if you see the picture, there are three couples there. And the idea was that some of the men dressed as women, some of the women dressed as men, some of the people were over 21, some were under. And we performed that at the base of the Trafalgar Square. And if you look at the picture, the middle couple, I'm the tall one, I was over 21, and my companion was Keith, who was under 21. The idea was, you know, how can you make this differentiation? We also did a demonstration early on about a book by Dr. David Rubin called Everything You Wanted to Know About Sex But Were Afraid to Ask, a ghastly sex education book, which was totally offensive. It talked about gay men and gay women using cucumbers and light bulbs to put into certain orifices. So we turned up at W.H. Allen's, the publishers, which is just by the law courts, on a Friday, because we knew the press would be around at the law courts, and therefore they'd take pictures of us, with a 10-foot paper mache cucumber and a letter to W.H. Allen explaining why we hated this book. Michael's favourite newsagent, W.H. Smith, also stopped the book. So we would go into branches of W.H. Smith and other booksellers, and if there was a pile of these books there, we would just accidentally knock them over. And where we couldn't do that, we put little notes in saying this book is full of lies, it's absolutely outrageous, don't buy it. So that was, you mentioned the Festival Light. I was actually at the Festival Light on that evening, and I remember Martin switching off the lights, but before he did that, some of the people were dressed up as nuns, and Tony Salvas was dressed up as a bishop. And I can remember he was totally convincing. Some of the women said, "Isn't it terrible what's going on around here?" He said, "It is, madam, but let's keep on sinning." And they unfurled a big banner for Cliff Richard saying, "Cliff for Queen." The only thing I now regret is that we set free a load of live white mice, which I don't think we should have done, but that caused havoc as well. So that was another, and of course the Miss World demo. So street theatre was fairly alive and vibrant. Okay, that's enough from me.
Well, could I just add on that street theatre about the books? That was one small thing that we did in Cardiff, putting leaflets inside the books. So
there's a picture that I don't know if you can see it. A picture of the demonstration. That's me on the far right. We were dressed up in black leotards and white face.
Okay, so clearly GLF was a real powerful force for change. I'm just really interested now in talking about the implosion of the GLF as it happened in 1972-73. Can you talk to me about your experience of that and where you think the frictions and where the fractures started to happen?
Yes, in a sense that the regular weekly meetings were too unwieldy to get anything done. So GLF broke down into various groups. There was the counter-psychiatry group that dealt with the way the psychiatry system, like EST was still used against gay people. There was street theatre, there was a women's group, a youth group, a media group, and an action group. And that was where the sort of work tended to get done. We did have GLF think-ins, which happened once every 6 months, where the big meeting met and then we all split up into tiny groups and came back again. But after a while, it became unwieldy. Because we wouldn't have a set structure, whoever got the microphone was the person who could speak the loudest. And so after a while, it was the small groups that started to do the practical work. I mean, they were the groups that eventually created the first gay newspaper, created Switchboard, which Michael can talk about more because he was involved in that. But also, eventually, because nothing was happening with the large groups, and they became so large because people came along to cruise and generally pick up, and so the whole thing got, people who really weren't into the politics of it. The first small group, a lot of the leaders of the GLF moved to Camden and set up a small group called the Camden GLF, and that would be in December 71. And Martin and I actually went and joined that group because of the people that were involved. But they also had small groups in West London, East London, down at Richmond. And so the small groups then became a focus. And then a group opened in Leeds, one in Edinburgh. And so the GLF spread out across the country, but it was no longer a big organization. It was now focusing on specific issues or specific localities. And there was a big break between the politicos, the far left people, and the radical drag queens who set up their own communes. And there was a very famous commune in Notting Hill where the drag queens went. And Julian Howes, who's, bless his heart, is still very much with us and politicking. I remember him saying that, come on to the Notting Hill commune. He says, we have, what was the word? We have no baths, but plenty of bubbles. And of course, that's the name of the book that Lisa Power wrote about the Gay Liberation Front. And there were always people wandering in and out. And there was also one in Bethnal Green called Bethnal Rouge. And they were our local commune. Can I mention one other thing that was very important that tends not to get mentioned? But we also had consciousness raising groups. I think that's the name we gave to them. Awareness groups. So, about 10 people would get together and we would discuss about our experiences as gay people, how as children and how things. That was about the personal and the political. And a lot of those consciousness raising groups created friendships that exist today. Martin mentions 2 people who live in Norfolk on a farm. They were part of my consciousness raising groups. and it was really showing how we oppressed ourselves. And I laugh now when I hear RuPaul saying, if you can't love yourself, how the hell are you going to love other people? Because that's exactly what the GLF motto was. You've got to love yourself. You are good before you can actually hope to change other people's minds. Over and out.
Yeah, so it's really, I think it's quite interesting because what I was reading, there were, one of the divisions that had happened in the GLF was there was a group of, I guess, men who were more interested in preserving ideas of masculinity, or what we call masc now, and groups of men who are more, I guess, more radical, the radical fairies, who are much more into challenging those sort of stereotypes or challenging gender roles. Did you feel that that was one of the divisions that had happened?
I think it was after the event. At the time, a lot has been made of this, and it certainly was, it did happen, but it wasn't such a clash as people think. But what it did mean is that the main meetings tended to be big arguments between those two sectors. And so they broke up. And so the drag queens went into communes mainly and continued in street theatre, whereas the people who were concerned about the politics and so on went perhaps into the small local groups or into a specific group like the counter psychiatry group. And I think too much is made of this about the men wanting to be macho and so on. I'm not sure it was true in the GLF, but it became that way when clubs started opening up and we got the clone era. And that was much more, that arose out of gay people becoming more visible. I'm not sure it was a result of what happened in GLF, because I think even the most macho men in GLF understood, because they were mixing with women and transgender people. I guess it's a bit like Black Lives Matter now. We don't realise when we've been racist, because we only now learning about the way our behaviours do that. And I think it was similar back then. We don't realise how sexist and macho we were being, but there was a lot of talk about sexism. So you had no excuse for not realising that your behaviour in this way was sexist. So I tend to think now that we're looking back on it, we can see that was what was happening. It wasn't so obvious at the time.
I think we should open the floor to questions. So members of the audience, please, if you have any questions, please do raise your hands now. Chris, do you have a question while we're waiting for some people to formulate theirs?
Yeah, I mean, this is all really fascinating, and it's great to get the more personal stories, because it's easy to kind of read about these things but not appreciate the kind of personal impact that it had, or I wonder if you could sort of name check some of the other people in the movement, like maybe Lisa Power or Ted Brown, and those, there's lots of people that we're maybe not representing the full range of people that were involved in the GLF. It's quite important to recognise there was a women's movement, yeah. You're still on mute.
Happy to do that. Yes, you mentioned Ted Brown and also Nettie Pollard. And if you want to learn more about them, please buy this month's Attitude, because they've both been interviewed. There's a lovely picture of them both. And of course, they're both very much involved still with the GLF 50th anniversary. There was the Radical Drag Queens. I mentioned Julian Howes. There was Michael James. Betty Bourne, of course, was part of the Radical Drag Queens. And he went on to form Blue Lips, a theatre group. And I really regret that a lot of you probably listening are too young to remember Blue Lips, but they really were radical drag and did some amazing theatre shows. And they used to sing songs like, oh goodness, Scream Your Tits Off, which is a song I think the Pink Singers should revive at some point. And I'd like to do the waltz, but my dress won't let me, and things like this. There was some, and they had someone who was hearing impaired who used to sing Secret Love, and was just amazing, because of course the melody was a bit dodgy, but the passion and the feeling was wonderful. Stuart Feather, of course, who's written a very good book about the Gay Liberation Front, which is worth reading. Stuart was around. They were the Radical Drag Queens. There it is, blowing the lid. Jackie Forster was one of the leading lights and for gay women, Jackie Forster had actually been a TV personality who came out, and there was a gay rights organisation for women whose name just escapes. Oh, Sappho. And there were people like Tony Salvas. There was members of the youth group. There were so many. There's I've forgotten, David Fernbach, who created Gay Men's Press, which released books that would be turned down by mainstream publishers. So there was a lot of that. And can I mention too something? We started things like gay days in the park. So this is before you had the Pink Singers on a Sunday afternoon. We'd all go to a park with food, bring food, drink, and happiness was the and the measure was closets are for clothes. And we would all go to the parks, and the first one was in Holland Park. Then we went to Hyde Park, and my home one was in Victoria Park in East London. And we used to play games where we'd all sit in a circle and throw a ball, and whoever caught the ball would have to get up and kiss the person who'd thrown it. So this created all sorts of wonderful differences. So you get men and women kissing women, women kissing men and men. Even a few heterosexuals wandered into the circle. And in Victoria Park one day, the police appeared, and they saw what they thought was two men kissing, and they went over to talk to them, and it turned out to be a man and a woman, so they couldn't do anything about it. But the first time I met Peter Tatchell was at a gay day in Battersea. He'd just come over from Australia at 19 years old, and that was the first event he ended up at. Was it a gay day in Battersea Park? Enough from me.
I have a question from Nikki. Really asking about how all of this history links into setting up of the Pink Singers Choir. Do you feel that there's a relationship between the two?
As we know, the Pink Singers are more linked into the Pride movement. So the link, I guess, is that GLF started the first Pride in 1972. There was this march we talked about in 71. The first official Pride march was 72. This is something that people always argue about, which should be the first Pride march. And the reason 72 was chosen because it was the Saturday closest to the Stonewall Rising. And now, traditionally, Pride falls, in London at any rate, on the first Saturday that was closest to Pride. So at the early Prides, we had a Caribbean steel band, which used to lead Pride, but we weren't allowed any floats. So it tended to be very much a march with the steel band. And often we'd end up in Hyde Park and we'd have a float. And Tom Robinson would appear. I think 1973, Tom Robinson would come and sing Glad to Be Gay. And we had a lot of sort of, there was Ruby and Stella, who were two lesbian singer-songwriters who used to come along, but nobody on the march sang. So in 83, an advert was put into Capital Gay, the London newspaper, to recruit people to come and sing at Pride. And you should all know, as good Pride members, that the Pink Singers, the rest is history. The Pink Singers have been singing ever since. But I'm guessing that the only other link I can think of was that GLF people joined the Pink Singers and never regretted it.
Thank you. So Pippa has a very interesting question. And I think this deals with a little bit around sort of what we would call identity politics nowadays. And one of the biggest challenges to organizing at the moment is fragmentation of ideologies, and often conflict between ideologies within the same umbrella. So would you be able to elaborate on how tensions or arguments within the groups that formed the GLF were resolved or not?
I don't know, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I've said too much. Michael and Martin want to talk about this, but I mean, in many cases they weren't resolved. I suppose that if Pride does nothing else, the Pride marches, it does bring us all together on one day where we can put our differences aside and often make connections and realize, well, hang on a minute, we are all allies, we've got lots in common. But it is a difficult one, and I don't think it's one you ever resolve.
Well, that's why our flag has all the colours in it, because it's not a case of coming together under a single colour, it's bringing the colours together. And that's what Pride is about, and that's really what I think GLF and Che as well were about. It was bringing people together.
It's why you needed GLF and Che, You needed both in order to make progress, because if it was just GLF, nothing would have happened, because we didn't want to, do anything that the law told us. We reject all that. But Che, and now Stonewall itself, the organisation, does that. So you're always going to need those. It's important then that you find common ground, because we are not our enemies. The enemy's out there, and we need to make sure that's the. And listen, keep listening. Don't pretend we know it all.
Yes, I went to one GLF meeting and was horrified to find that they didn't have a constitution or even a set of standing orders. And I never went back because it just wasn't my style. CHE always had those things. So did Switchboard. So the meetings were all very well organized, contributions from everyone, balanced discussion, not necessarily a conclusion. And then more heated discussion afterwards over a drink before you went home afterwards. And I think that's what enabled both Switchboard and CHE. Or did you say Che or Shay? There was a big discussion about how you pronounced it. and that enabled everything to hold together. And also, by the way, integrate women, because in the 70s, lesbian invisibility was a thing, and I think it still is, because men naturally step forward and are told that they are born leaders. As soon as you have any organisation, within days, the men try to take over, and then the women can't stand what's going on and move away. And loads of organisations did that. But Gay Switchboard kept together, and Pink Singers now includes women and men, although it didn't in the early days.
But don't forget that Gay Switchboard, there was two switchboards. There was Lesbian Line and Gay Switchboard.
Yes.
And we had an away weekend one weekend, and the lesbians held an extraordinary general meeting while we were away for the weekend, and they changed the name of the organisation to London Lesbian and Gay Switchboard, and it became a very integrated organisation. That's my phone ringing, sorry.
Yeah, that's right. It was Gay Switchboard, then London Gay Switchboard, then London Lesbian and Gay Switchboard, and now just Switchboard. Lesbian Line would only speak to women, and if a man's voice, I don't know how they
and feminists, they would only speak to feminist women.
Yeah, and women and men phoned us a Gay Switchboard, so we wanted to keep our files up to date. So we'd have to talk to them to make sure our information was correct. And what you had to do was to dial the number. They'd say Lesbian Line, and you'd say, "This is Gay Switchboard," because otherwise they'd hang up, and then they'd say, "Okay, what do you want to know?" And then there was a conversation. But I think organisations in general are much more well integrated across all genders and sexualities now, but in the 70s they weren't. My view is it was largely due to the attitude and ingrained habitual behaviour of men, and basically their inability to understand how they were upsetting women. Anyone who joined Gay Switchboard it was like a university in anti-sexism. If anybody said anything that wasn't considered correct, they were just politely told. It was written about in the logbook, and you couldn't get away with anything. But nobody was banned. You were educated, and that way we slowly built up more and more women joining the organisation.
I should mention that two women who were very influential in the early GLF days, and that's Mary McIntosh and Elizabeth Wilson, who were both academics. And I remember Elizabeth particularly in some of these boisterous meetings, sitting knitting all the way through the meeting, and then grabbing the microphone occasionally and sort of bursting the bubbles of all these pompous men. And eventually, I think it was January 7th, 1972, that the women said, "Look, we don't need this anymore. We're going to go off and do our own thing, but we're still around." And I remember one year, I think it was 1975, when women held their own Pride March a week before the main Pride March because they needed that to be by themselves.
Thank you very much. I think it's great that a phone call came in while we were talking about the London Lesbian and Gay Switchboard. Strangely ironic, but appropriate. We have time for one last question, and this is from Simon Harrison. And it's to all of you. What is the remedy for internalized homophobia? What helped you to love yourself, given obviously the environment that you were growing up in?
For me, I think it's an internal switch which is able to turn immediate feelings of shame into feelings of anger, first at myself and then at the assumption that I should feel ashamed. So at the person who's, so it's kind of a controlled anger, which makes, you know, it makes me ashamed of being ashamed. And I think that's what keeps me going, I suppose.
I guess what GLF did for me was actually say, because I lived a double life in the sense that I would go to the gay bars the weekends and live, and I never told anybody about it. So there clearly was shame there, but I was quite happy with that. It seemed the way to be. So what GLF did was say, no, gay is good. It's fine. Nothing wrong with you. The problem isn't in with you. It's with, you know, the views of society and all the misinformation that's out there. So I guess that's why GLF changed my life around, really.
I think maybe one thing we should mention before we finish is that, you know, Dan Glass, he's kind of been reviving the GLF in a sort of modern form, and he's just published his new book called United Queerdom: From the Legends of the Gay Liberation Front to the Queers of Tomorrow. So I think, you know, we're talking about the sort of legacy in terms of the 80s and the fragmentation of protest agendas, but, you know, we're very much in a time now where protest is needed, and I think it's really interesting that, you know, people are sort of reviving the Gay Liberation Front and placing, you know, a framework on that. I don't know if any of you have any thoughts about that.
Dan was interviewed on Loose Ends on Saturday about his book, and of course that program is repeated tomorrow on Radio 4.
So
From
Dan
streets
has
to Radio 4. We must have arrived if we're on Radio 4.
Dan has a very active Facebook group on the Gay Liberation Front. So if you're interested in finding out more about the GLF and about activities around the GLF, then please join that group. They had a meeting just before lockdown, which unfortunately I flew back from Singapore literally a couple of hours before that, and I missed. But since then, all of the meetings have been cancelled. So one to plan for when the lockdown lifts. Anyway, I want to say thank you very much. We have come to the end of this roundtable. So once again, a round of applause to Martin, Philip, and Michael, and to Chris for this very interesting hour of discussion. And if you want to find out more about the Pink Singers, obviously go to our website, www.pinksingers.co.uk. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a good day.